Hello everyone, Frederik here. So, I wrote an article about posture a while back, and the thing is with that article is that it is very long and it is quite dense. And some people have told me that it's really interesting, but it's too long. So, I thought I'd do something about that and make a little video series explaining some of the concepts in that article, adding a little bit of a visual material and just doing it a little bit differently. If you're interested in the original article, I'll drop a link to that in the description below. Um, that's pretty much it. In this first section, we'll look at some of the concepts of what is posture in the first place and a little bit of the history. Yeah, so enjoy. Thank you for watching. Okay, so as we start our discussion about posture, it's important to realize exactly what it is that we are talking about. And the trouble with the word posture is that posture often has it has a static quality to it, and other phrases that we might use instead of posture, structure, attitudes, or stance, also has this static quality. Then we have other phrases like deportment or carriage, which is much older words, and they've really fallen out of favor at the moment. So we're a little bit stuck there. So perhaps for the present time, we kind of have to make do with posture and then just specify that really what we're talking about is dynamic posture. There was the movement pioneer Moshe Feldenkrais. He differentiated between posture and acture, which is to say that we have a static shape, the posture, we have it in standing, and then there's shapes the body goes through in motion, which is the acture. So they're related, but they're not the same. So one of the things that makes us human is the fact that we stand up straight, our posture, our upright posture. Of course, there's been a lot of discussion what made us stand up in the first place. So the early hominids in Africa, why did they stand up? And of course, there's benefits in terms of when you're foraging or if you want to spot predators. But when we did stand up and we began to have this upright posture, then it also enabled us to have our gait, our human gait, so we could walk and we could run. And then there's people who say, like, well, the walking and especially the running was what helped us become proficient persistence hunters. That may well be the case. There's another point of view where they're making the point that actually when you stand up you can generate a lot more force and power, which is quite useful if you're competing with other hominids and you have a comparative power advantage, which means that you can punch and slap and crush and whatever you want to do to your opponent. Of course, there is a downside to all this. It is a lot easier to stabilize the spine if you are supported from both the shoulders and the hips, where we as humans now we're only stable from the hips, so we have to continually contend with gravity's pull downwards, while at the same time having this upright spine. So the interesting thing about posture is the fact that it's the living expression of our structure. And it's interesting to look at the prehistory and how might we have used our bodies in the past. But at the same time, we're quite limited because we can only know, or we only have the hard tissues of history. So we have bones and arrowheads and monuments, but we don't have the soft tissues. That is to say, we don't have the cultural technologies or the ceremonies or the things that people did. And a large part of posture is exactly what people did. So we're kind of stuck at that point. Now, one way out of this particular conundrum is to look at populations that haven't changed so much since the Stone Age. As the argument goes, like if you can look at a population and it hasn't changed its culture since the Stone Age, then it might also tell us something about our prehistory. So there has been some studies into the postures of tribes from various places around the globe, and in one of these studies they found that there's more than 1,000 different postures that people routinely use, and that these vary quite a lot according to geography. And just as an example of this, like if you go to the Indian subcontinent, you find a lot more sitting with the legs crossed in front, and if you go to Native American tribes, you will more often see people sitting with the legs straight out in front. And this kind of goes in the direction of this. So similarly, we have this expression white boy hips, which is to say that if you're from the north, you are much more likely to be, restricted in the hips. Now, is this actually true, or is this just kind of an urban legend? Well, there's certainly something to it if you look at the folk dances. You realize there's a horizontal line going across the globe, and if you go above that line, you find very little hip movement in the dances. So like line dancing and whatever else dancing you have from the north all keep the hips quite still, and very little articulation of the hip. Whereas if you go south of this line, you find you can have the belly dance, or you can have the hula from Polynesia, you can have Brazilian samba, all the dances from Africa all have a lot of hip movement. So there's certainly something to this geographical distribution of movement. If we follow this line of inquiry further, there's been some studies into looking at, like, is there actually a difference between indigenous people and how their physical practices actually manifest in the body? Like, is that different from what you find in Western populations? There's been at least one study that's found that that there is a lot more degenerative changes in Western population compared to some indigenous people. That's just to say that there is something like the differences in the way that we use our body has a marked physical effect. So this of course raises the question, how exactly does cultural practices shape our bodies over time? So this is as far as we can go in looking at the history and the anthropology. Now let's have a brief look at what the written history could tell us. Now, after having considered the archaeology and anthropology of posture, let's now have a little bit of a look at what written history might tell us as well. So some of the first written sources that we have for anything is the Egyptians. And if there's something that should be pretty clear from looking at Egyptian art, it is the fact that Egyptians really liked straight and things that are upright. And this goes for both the humans that are portrayed and the deities as well. It's also in Egyptian culture that we find one of the first medical systems that's actually written down. And not only that, but we also find that they had a system of bone setting more than 5,000 years ago. So this might be the Egyptian equivalent of early chiropractics. If we then zoom forward another 1,000 years or so and go to ancient Greece, they were definitely also thinking and talking about man and what is posture. So we have a story about Plato's man here. Plato's definition of man is subject to interpretation, but one famous anecdote gives an explicit if satirical Platonic definition. Based on the dialogues, animals were classified into quadrupeds and bipeds, and then divided amongst those with feathers, birds, and those without. Plato, and possibly Socrates, commented that man stood upright on two legs, without feathers, making him distinct from other animals. This definition was rebuffed by Diogenes of Sinope, who brought Plato a plucked chicken as an example of Plato's man. After consideration, Plato amended the definition to include broad, flat nails differentiating from a plucked chicken's talons. His definition, then, is that man is an upright, featherless biped with broad, flat nails. So, obviously we have philosophical differences about exactly what defines man, but we also have to just have a little bit of a look at the Greek art, and we'll realize that they definitely had an understanding of posture. So the older statues from the Archaic period, they have quite a remarkable balance in the structure. Now, they don't quite have the muscularity that you see later. Like, obviously, if you look at Farney's Hercules, he's massive and epic forearms and obliques. Maybe there's a little bit less of a structural elegance in Hercules, but then he has the forearms. So, okay, so jumping forward about 1,000 years, we end up in the Renaissance, and here two men's work stand out. So first we have Michelangelo with David, which is just about one of the finest achievements in the history of art. And like, there's a remarkable symmetry and balance in David, and the proportions are perfect. Again, he doesn't quite have the muscularity of Hercules, but then we have the work of Da Vinci. And obviously you can say a lot about Da Vinci and why his work is important. It's one of the first really modern works of anatomy, and his sketches are still insightful even to this day. I just want to pick up on one particular point here, and that's the fact that if you look at the spinal sketches that Da Vinci did, they show an S-curve in the spine, but it's a lot more shallow than what you will find in modern medical textbooks. And then you might ask yourself, like, why is that so? I think it's fair to say that Da Vinci probably didn't have any preconceived notions of why a spine should be any particular way. He documented what he found. And so it's at least interesting to speculate that maybe the spines, or the average spines at least, have changed since Da Vinci's time. So we now find more pronounced S shapes in medical textbooks simply because that's what you find in more of the population. But whether that's useful is another discussion unto itself. The final thing to think about as we wrap up this little look at the history of posture is what brings us to the modern era, and that is the ideals from the Victorian era. And it's pretty plain to see that once you get to the Victorian era, they're definitely concerned with being upright, about having good body posture. But there's also something else going on. There's definitely a cultural and behavioral aspect to the whole idea of posture as well. Like, there's definitely a moral drive to being the upstanding citizen and not letting, shall we say, earthly desires take root. So uprightness, but also a culture of uptightness. You might say that the stiff upper lip was born. And it might seem a little bit quaint, but some of these things are still with us. And if anything, it's a good example of how culture and body are interdependent. So things shifted again in the 1960s and 70s, the cultural counter-revolution and the whole hippie phenomenon. And that definitely had a bodily component as well. And the Victorian uprightness and uptightness gave way to more relaxed and fluid ideals. But then, just as the ideas of the Victorian era was quote-unquote a bad idea, then it is quite often that the opposite of a bad idea is just another bad idea. And it may well be that the relaxed body ideals that we got from the cultural counter-revolution and that didn't exactly serve us. So that wraps up our introduction and discussion about the history and anthropology of posture, and in the next video in the series we'll have a look at how the combination of posture and consumerism may well be a suspicious idea. Yep, thank you for watching.